afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar of the India International Center. This is going to be a very interesting session because it features Shivaji Das, a very talented young writer based out of Singapore, an adventurer and a traveler. And he is going to talk about the other Shangri-La, journeys through the Sino-Tibetan border in Sichuan, the borderland between the old Tibet and China, what was at one time called Outer Tibet. This is a very fascinating journey, in fact, several journeys, and a very fascinating book. But I think the best person to describe the book is Shivaji himself, with the spirit of the author. So in the few minutes that I have as an introduction, I'm going to touch upon the word Shangri-La and relate a little story which I hope will capture some of the spirit of the lecture and the book. Now, Shangri-La is not a Chinese name, as you know. In fact, the R and the L together are very difficult for Chinese to pronounce. Shangri-La is the name of a mythical place which was first written about by James Hilton in his book, The Lost Horizon. This was set during the Second World War, and it features an aircraft that is flying from Afghanistan across southern Tibet into southern China, Sichuan, in fact, the city of Chongqing, which was the headquarters of Chiang Kai-shek and his army. And what happens to this plane is that it crashes in southern Tibet, somewhere, nobody knows where. People are safe, but they get out and they wander about. They come across this beautiful paradise called Shangri-La, with wise men, beautiful women, all manner of things. And then, of course, after a while there, they go back to their countries, but nobody ever can find Shangri-La again. This is the story. Now, when I was visiting those borderlands, the Yunnan side, a dusty little town called Zhongdian way back in 2003, and Shivaji mentions Zhongdian in his book. I met the mayor of Zhongdian, and Zhongdian had just been called Shangri-La. Name had been officially changed. It was the first place in China to have that name. Now there are more, as Shivaji says in his book. So I asked the mayor, how did you choose this name which is not pronounceable by most Chinese people? He said, well, I read this book, James Hilton. I took a map. I plotted the course of the plane. And what did I find? It went just above the city of Zhongdian. So I said, well, I'll change the name. It will become a huge tourist attraction. I'll make a lot of money. Everybody will make money. And that's exactly what he did. So this story, I think, encapsulates various things which Shivaji will, I'm sure, cover. It is ancient history, mythology, spiritualism, adventure, travel, mystery, commerce, tourism, crassness, all manner of things. Of course, apart from humor and a very lively set of characters. So, having said that, and I think I've taken a minute less than my allotted quota, but that is all to the good. Before I hand over to Shivaji, just to remind you, we will be talking for about 25 minutes. Is that right, Shivaji? Then we will have questions and answers. Please post your questions in the chat box that you will see on your site. and I will do my best to uh, see that as many questions as possible are answered depending on time limitations. Or else, please, I seek your permission to summarize the questions or uh, put them in some priority. I might not be able to answer, or rather uh, put them in the right sequence for Shivaji to answer, but we'll do our best. So, having said that, now Shivaji, it is over to you, and I'm sure we all look forward to your presentation. I particularly because it will remind me of, I think, three journeys I made many years ago, both on the mostly on the Yunnan side, but also one on the Sichuan side of this fascinating countryside. Over to you now, Shivaji.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Ravi. A very good afternoon, good evening here to all of you. And thanks to the India International Center, IIC. It's an honor for me to be talking about my latest book in this session today. So what I'll do is share a little bit more about the journey, as well as some pictures from the book and some stories, which will perhaps give you a bit of flavor about what this Other Shangri-la is all about. So if you allow me, let me show you some of the pictures from the trip. Let's go there. Okay, I believe you can see the pictures on the slide right now. So this is all about a trip through the Sino-Tibetan frontier in Sichuan. Now, Sichuan is a province, a pretty large province in southwest of China. And what we did in this trip, and this trip, when I say we, I mean myself and my wife, who is actually from the mainland China. She's a Singaporean now, just like myself, but both of us were born outside. I was born in India and I grew up and studied in India. And then I came over to Singapore. The same thing with my wife. She grew up in China, and then she came to Singapore to study and has been here since then. So we together took this kind of a 1-month journey. We started from Chengdu, which is the largest city in the province of Sichuan. It's at the plains. And then we moved up and west all the way to the Tibetan highlands, the Tibetan Qinghai Plateau, as it is known as. And these were pretty arduous journeys. But at the same time, the interesting thing about this part of the world is that while it is culturally and geographically sort of part of Tibet, as Mr. Ravi mentioned, it was considered as the outer Tibet. But in terms of today's conditions, it is much easier, at least in that point of time when we traveled there 2 years back, it was much easier to travel. In Tibet, for instance, you can only travel as part of a group, but there were no such restrictions in going to this part of the world. And also, many of the other factors in Tibet, for instance, you cannot witness a sky burial in person. These are some restrictions for outsiders in Tibet. Some of these were not present, at least at that point of time, when we traveled to this part of the world. So we went from Chengdu to Kangding first, then we went to Litang, then we went to Daocheng and Yading, then we came back all the way, and then we went to Serta, Bame, and Danba. Now, all these places have special importance because when I talk about this area, they have several mountains which are close to 7,000 meters high. And then you have several valleys, you have many famous rivers which originate from near about this area. So the nature is kind of spectacular. But what is more interesting for me in particular is that because of these valleys and highlands and mountains, there are many scattered settlements. And even though they are Tibetans, they are Hans, they are mix of both, over time they have created these unique cultures with unique traditions, which bring a lot of diversity, despite that umbrella cover of Tibetans or Hans that we think this region to represent. So from that perspective, this trip was really enriching for me in particular. Now, I'll share some of the pictures from the trip, and that should give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So this is one of the most beautiful landscape that we visited. And this area, this is around Riva or Daocheng, is what Joseph Rock had also visited. Joseph Rock was the famous National Geographic explorer, and some say Joseph Hilton's book, The Shangri-La, was kind of or The Lost World was kind of based on Joseph Rock's actual travel, because John Hilton had actually never gone to this part of the world. So as you can see, the landscape is spectacular. Of course, you have a lot of tourists at this point, Chinese domestic tourists, because this has gained a popularity, particularly during autumn. But nonetheless, it has managed to retain its pristine quality, and spectacular during autumn, spectacular during winter, and all seasons. There are also many valleys, as I mentioned, and this mountain in particular, which stands out of the Tagong Valley, is considered one of the holiest for people in this region. And we happen to travel around these valleys where the nomads, Tibetan nomads, are still practicing a very traditional lifestyle. And you can see the yaks that they herd. And we were fortunate enough to be able to spend a few days and nights with some of these families. Now, one thing I should mention is that when you talk about these highlands and you talk about these valleys, naturally the roads are definitely going to be dangerous. So despite the views, despite the massive spending by the Chinese government in infrastructure, the landscape is such that it's very hard to maintain these roads, and the winding nature and the precipitous falls that you have means that along our journeys, we saw many coffins of vehicles which had finally given up on their life along this deadly highway. So at this point, I will read a short excerpt about this famous Sichuan-Tibet highway, which should give an idea of what traveling around this area is all about. Here it goes. We were traveling along the 2,142 kilometer long Sichuan-Tibet highway, or Highway 318, one of the most dangerous roads in the world. Truck drivers didn't consider fellow mates a man unless he had dared and survived Highway 318. Our van continued galloping over the unpaved road. The driver got back to his phone. Below, the mad river flowed on and on. Occasionally, from the other direction, a van rushed at us, causing scare among all of us. Rhythmically, the passengers cleared their throats and spat on the plastic bags tactfully placed next to each seat. Soon the road became even more miserable. The driver seemed nervous for the first time and stopped talking on the phone. He even turned off the music, something Tibetans can't live without. Tibetan women sitting next to us chanted mantras in anxious voices, blowing and bursting chewing gums at the same time. A young monk sitting behind us began vomiting. To comfort him, his neighbor began chanting the Avalokiteshvara mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum. Hadn't I sung this song before in a spa in Singapore? So that was about traveling along these highways, these treacherous highways. But one of the towns that I mentioned earlier is this town of Kangding, which is perhaps the first biggest town on the frontier between these Tibetan highlands and the plains of Greater China. And you can see here on this picture a book, a concrete book, which actually has the lyrics of China's most popular love song. And it's called the Kangding Love Song. Of course, to know more, you have to read the book. But this is an icon in this part of the world. And everyone in China who has been born in the 50s, 60s, all the way to the 70s, and even now, they all know about this Kangding love song. I talked about nomads earlier, and a small percentage of Tibetans still live their life as nomads. And we happen to live with one of the families for a few days. And as you can see, the whole setting, the nomad tent next to a river, surrounded by all these glorious mountains, is of course fantastic. But the nomads still have very tough life. Life expectancy is much lower than the average Tibetan or average Chinese, Han Chinese. And also there are many social issues as well. For instance, this family we were living with, the daughter, even though she was 8 years old, was not going to school, whereas the son, who was much younger, was going to the school. Having said that, many Tibetan nomads still practice polyandry and polygamy. Yeah? So both these are practiced, and that's because they want to avoid division of the resources, which are mainly these yaks, which are their main resources, between families as and when they have kids and they get married to different families. So at this point, let me also do a short reading about our conversation with one of the nomads who we happen to live with. Here it goes. Winter is the hardest time for us, Tashi told us. The yaks can only eat dry grass then, but that is not enough. Many yaks die in winter. Some of us go to lower elevations, next to rivers and streams. Yet even today, winter could bring peril for the nomads. During extended period of snowstorms, remote herds could get cut off for weeks from larger settlements. Then the clock of death starts ticking. If someone is lost for a few days, the yaks die first, said Tashi. If a yak dies, the man will die, too, if he can't come back in time. Sometimes a son dies in front of his father right after the yak has died. After dinner, Tashi described about how she had met Sonam, her husband, at a festival in Tagong. There were more than 150 people who came for my wedding. The husband has to pay for the feast and for everything else. She showed us her 2 gold teeth and giggled like a young girl. I got these gold teeth at my wedding. All Tibetan women must have these gold teeth. She was curious about how my wife and I had got married. Who paid for the expenses? How many people attended? Did you also get gold teeth? She asked my wife. Let me now move on to the next part of the journey. And this is one of the very unique settlements that we have in nearby Sertar, and it's called the Larum Monastery. It's considered as one of the largest Buddhist monasteries in the world. At some point of time, there are about 10,000 monks who are living in these very small red houses, if I can call them, which is good enough to store just one bed and a gas stove. So they were living there. But there has been fires, there has been government restrictions on number of people who can live in. And at some point of time, there has been as low as 2,000 monks who have been living there. And these monks don't just come from the Tibetan community, they also come from the Han people from northeast of China and also southeast of China who decide to become monks for various reasons or nuns for various reasons. And you can see in this picture, there is a line, there is this road going through, and anyone above that line are actually the nuns, anyone below that line are the monks. That's how the living quarters are organized there. And you can see how dense these settlements are. It's actually a new setup. It was built only around the 1980s, but today has become one of the main centers of Tibetan Buddhism. And a big number of the patrons actually happen to be the rich businessmen from southeast, the coast of China, who have been traveling there and sustaining the buildings of monasteries and funding many of the scholars their day-to-day expenses as well. At this point of time, let me talk a little bit about a conversation that we had with some of the monks over here. It takes 5 or 6 days to build such a house here, one of the young monks explained. You pay 7,000 to 8,000 yuan to buy something like this. That's close to about $1,200 US dollars. He says, the rent gets cheaper as one goes higher up in the mountains. That's where the children stay. They often stay together. Earlier, you could get a place for even 3,000 yuan, but nowadays everything is expensive. We asked the monks about the abundance of soggy biscuits and rotten food that could be seen on all the rooftops. People just throw things out of their kitchens, the monks smiled. Or they feed birds and cats to gain merit, and then they always forget to clean up. After lunch, we walked through the female quarters. There were notices outside every lady's toilet proclaiming, gentlemen, you will lose merit if you enter the women's toilet. So that is how sort of life is in this part of Sichuan. And this settlement is about 4,000 meters in altitude. Yeah, you can imagine the kind of weather conditions they have there. And this is where also we were fortunate or unfortunate enough to witness a sky burial. And according to Tibetan burial customs, the dead body is not considered to have the soul of the person anymore. So there is relatively less attachment to the dead body. And the practice that they follow in traditional way is to feed the dead body to the eagles and vultures. Yeah. And oftentimes, after the birds have eaten some parts of the body, to make it easier for the bird, the body is then chopped up into smaller pieces, and these pieces are then fed to the vultures, many of whom are available in plenty in this particular part of the world. Now, many people can be shocked. Many tourists, when they see sky burial, they are quite shocked. But it makes perfect sense, given the weather conditions and the geographic condition there. Because, as you may know, the layer of crust in such highlands is very thin. So there are no big trees and there's no firewood easily available. It's very expensive. And also you can't just put the body on water, and you can't bury as well because the soil is only this thick. And so a sky burial is a very human way of dealing with dead bodies in this part of the world. And also Tibetans believe that vultures and birds in particular, they are sacred animals. And once they consume the dead body, when they fly, they actually take the person closer to the heavens. Yeah? So that's one of the logic. But also you can see the government has kind of started to make it a tourist attraction in some way. And you can have this museum, which is located very next to this burial site in Larum. Now, this particular area is also the home ground of Gesar. Gesar is one of the mythical characters in Tibet, Qinghai, Mongolia. And his epic, the Epic of Gesar, is like the Ramayana or Mahabharata, one of the well-known epics of the world. But it's also the longest. It's considered the longest song, epic song. And at the same time, it is still not finished. It has been written for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But people are still adding stories. They are still adding songs. They're still adding tales of heroism to Gesar as he fights demons and as he fights other people. Gesar was arguably present in Sertar, one of the places we visited, and his statue can be seen everywhere, and his museum is also present there. Now, at this point, I'll talk a little bit about Gesar and his importance and what has happened in the last few years. When we mentioned Gesar to our driver friends, they would always break into yodeling, like that. Even today, nomads sang scenes from the epic when they got together at night around the fire. The Epic of Gesar remained a living tale, and singers were adding adventures to the already long story even to this date. Sertar also holds an annual Gesar rap festival. The first Chinese translation of the Epic of Gesar was written by Professor Ren Naiqiang, a Han academic from Sichuan. He was also arguably the man who made the first complete map of Tibet. Fascinated by Tibetan culture, Professor Ren learned a Kham dialect and went on to marry a Tibetan woman. During his wedding festival, local singers sang the Epic of Gesar, and he was noting all of it down. So he spent a good amount of time during his own wedding actually translating these songs into Mandarin. I was certain that Professor Ren had chosen his life partner only to hear the Epic of Gesar on his own terms. So that was about Gesar, and let me now move on to another very interesting valley, and this is the Danba Valley. And these are these ancient stone towers, very long stone towers, which are still surviving in these villages. Incidentally, some of these villages around Danba, the town, like Zhonglu, Jiazhu, they have been called by National Geographic as the most scenic villages in the whole of China. I think this was announced about 5 years back. So some of these villages have been commercialized, but many of them still retain their old character. Now, these kind of stone towers can be seen in other parts of the world as well, like in the Caucasus countries, like Georgia, in parts of southern Russia. You can see very similar towers. And no one knows for sure why these towers were built. The theory is that they were built to look out for strangers or invaders. Some even say that men build these towers to see whether other men were coming into their house secretly when they were going out. So they would themselves hide into these towers to see who was visiting their house when they were away. Now, this particular part was arguably a queendom, which means that they always had a queen instead of kings. The reign passed from queen to queen. And the women of this region were famous for their courage and also for their beauty, for their skin, because they say the water is very pure and that's why they are always glowing. So they're known both for their beauty and their courage. At the same time, the area around, the larger area around this place is called as the Kham region. So Tibet is divided into 4 large areas, one of which is Kham. And the Kham men in particular are considered the most eligible bachelors in the whole of China. And there has been a novel by Shivaji which has talked a lot about the character of the Kham men, which has led to this popularity. And they're considered as tall, dark, and handsome in the very true sense of this word. So you have this bigger part where the men are considered the most eligible, and you have this small valley whose women are considered the most beautiful and the most courageous. So naturally, you have a lot of love triangles, which has been happening over time between these 2 regions. So today, based on the reputation of the women of Danba, every year there is a beauty contest which is held in this town. And the villages from all around Danba, they send their chosen nominee to this village to compete there. It's like any other beauty contest. There's a talent show, there's speech, there's question and answer, all that happens in various rounds. We didn't know about this beauty contest. And actually, when we're passing through Danba, we accidentally chanced upon the beauty contest, which was happening. So these are some pictures from the beauty contest. And the young lady you can see towards your screen on the left, she was one of the shortlisted 20 who made on to the finals. And the winners are given silver flowers, golden flowers, and they also nowadays can get a lot of career uplift if they are winning. So here I'll read a little bit about my conversation with her. I spoke with one of the shortlisted girls as a grandmother, half of Lamo's height, grinned beside her. Lamo, the chosen beauty, was studying mass communications in a university in Chengdu and hoped to work in the tourism sector someday. I'm so happy, Lamo said. I had been practicing for this for the last 6 months. The toughest part of the preparations is to know about Danba's history and culture. The judges can ask any question on that, but my family helps me a lot. Whenever I had some query about our culture, I would always ask my grandmother. I asked if she had been nervous on stage. Yes, of course. Even after all the preparations, anything can happen. If something goes wrong, it's so shameful. All the people from my village are here. So are people from all the other villages as well. My family would lose face, but that's okay. My whole village would lose face. I don't know how my 3 minutes passed. I have no memory. I'm just very, very happy. Now, also, as I was mentioning, this is at the frontier. So you have the confluence of Tibetans, Hans. Many Hans are now running business in these areas. And historically, this has also been a region of conflict. In fact, many of the self-immolations which have happened has been taking place in this region. So from time to time, foreigners, tourists have been banned entry to this area. And the Larum Monastery that I talked about, even though we were able to go at that point of time, from my knowledge, as of now, no foreigners or tourists are allowed to visit that monastery again. So all these and the history has led to a very unique situation where the 2 communities live with each other. There has definitely been material gains in the life of the Tibetan people who live there, in particular women who have got a lot more rights. The living standards have improved, incomes have improved. And at the same time, they also feel threatened to a threat to their culture. And also it's part of the overall bigger China-Tibet question. So with that, I will read a little bit from the epilogue and the concluding part of the book. So here it goes. I had hoped that the emphasis of this trip would be on Shangri-La, but it was the other that was often the most conspicuous. The other types of caterpillar fungus, the other capitals of the queendom, the other Panchen Lama, the other Karmapa Lama, the other government in exile, the other versions of history, the other interpretation of every development in the region, the other race, the other Shangri-La. So with that, I'll conclude my speech. The book is available in India as well as many places, and it's also available online on Amazon and Flipkart and major bookstore. I'd like to thank in particular Konarak Publishers, my publishers, for this book, for giving all the support and having faith in this piece of work. So thanks to Mr. Nair and his whole team, who has been much of a joy for me to work with. And I look forward to such sessions where we have people very curious about others. And that is the whole point of writing a book such as this. So with that, I would like to thank you and everyone for attending this, and I'll hand it over back to you, Mr. Ravi. Thank you.
Thank you, Shivaji. That was a very fascinating, interesting account of your journey and the different aspects of that journey, including the landscapes, the people, the anecdotes, the human stories, and of course the excerpts from your book. Now, before I turn to questions from the floor, of which I can not see too many right now, so I would remind people to post their questions. I would like to start off by asking you a question myself. And this concerns the nomads and what you told us about their life. It's a hard life and so on. And also the modernization and the problems of culture and benefit, of course, economic benefit, but also the cultural issues. So, in your talks with the nomads, what do they think of the Chinese program of modernization? As you know, there are two views. That one view says, well, the nomads must be left alone to in their traditional way, and the other view says, no, they are like everybody else. They should be part of modernization. What was your own observation of this situation when you talk to these people?
Yeah. So my understanding of the situation with nomads is based on not just the family that I lived with, but also many other experts who have done research on this topic. In fact, when we came back to Chengdu, we were fortunate enough because of my other books. I was giving some talks and I was having some interactions with people about my previous books. And I got to meet quite a few experts, anthropologists and others who have been working with nomads. So my understanding today is based on that as a whole. Now, what has happened over time is that, as I mentioned, nomads' quality of life has improved significantly. And many have actually switched from a nomadic life to a more settled life. Now, that some people say has been done in a voluntary way, and some people say that has been done in a mandated way. Yeah? But what has also happened is that despite the mandated nature of the move in some cases by the government, many nomads decided to move back. They decided to go back to their traditional lifestyle. There were many reasons cited for this. One was that when they came to the city, they found that things which they considered free, things like cheese, things like butter, all the yogurt, all the products from the yak, which they considered as free, suddenly they had to pay, and they had to pay quite a lot for getting these things. The women are very active. They are one of the most hardworking people I have met because of their work with the yaks and the fields all day. They were now living a sedentary life, and many were also getting diseases like diabetes and all. So some decided to go back to their places. And also what has happened is that now many of the nomads, they can supplement their income by picking caterpillar mushroom. Now, this caterpillar mushroom is like a traditional medicine product, which has become a big hit all over China, and the product is really expensive. And nomads have demarcated areas for themselves where they can pick these mushrooms during certain periods of time in the year, and that has really helped to supplement their income. So at one point, while the move back to the city was mix of voluntary and mandated, and that led to being part of the greater economy, but a certain percentage of them moved back and they have kind of stabilized at that situation. So like with everything about Tibet, about China, about this whole equation, there are multiple views, and perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between.
So there's a question here from Joya Roy, who is very clearly an experienced traveler in that region, because she's asked a kind of geographical question. Did you approach the area south of Pao from where the routes to Pemako begin?
From what I know, they are part of the proper Tibet province. They are not part of the area where we were traveling. Yes, so it's a bit of a different area from what I know.
Okay, thank you. Now, there are two questions which are very similar from Aruna Rodriguez, and also another question on language, Tibetan language. So, what languages do the people in the region speak? Do they speak Tibetan, other languages of the various ethnicities? Do all of them speak Mandarin as a second language, or even the first? How do they all mix and live together?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and thanks for asking that. And as with everything in this part of the world, it's a very contentious issue. The issue of language is a very contentious issue, particularly it's teaching in schools. Of course, in this part of the world, both Tibetan and Mandarin was taught, but significant more resources were towards teaching of Mandarin. So all the people that we encountered, except for the nomads, some of whom didn't speak any Mandarin, everyone else we met were speaking Mandarin, and that's how we would interact with them. Because, of course, I speak very broken Mandarin, but my wife is a Chinese national at that point of time, so she could speak and interact with them. So it was not very hard to interact and communicate with them. But among the nomads, there were many who didn't speak any Mandarin, but we had some people who had worked in the cities at some point of time, and now they have gone back or got married to nomad families who spoke broken Mandarin, and that's how we managed to interact with them. Now, an interesting part is that Tibetan language has become kind of fashionable, yes? Particularly the script has become kind of fashionable, and there's a lot of fascination in the whole of China with Tibetan culture, Tibetan songs, Tibetan dressing, Tibetan men, Tibetan women, Tibetan script. Some of the new brands in mainland China, they use the Tibetan Tibetan script as a way to signal their either exotic nature or draw certain brand affiliations. Yeah. And like I mentioned before, the Southeast China, the rich people, the traders, the manufacturers, they have been promoting a lot Buddhism in this part of the world by sponsoring many of the gurus, by being their students and all that. And that has sort of sustained the entire culture a bit, given another boost to the whole culture in this place.
Thank you, Shivaji. Now, there's a question about from Harpreet. What sort of reactions were there from the local people when you told them that you are from India? And if I may add to that question, seeing that your wife is of Chinese origin, what sort of questions did they have, or observations?
Yeah, that was something which was quite shocking for me. And wherever we went, when they heard that I was from India, there would be a crowd around me. And this part of where we visited, they are not necessarily followers of the sect which Dalai Lama belongs to. Many of them are actually followers of the other sect, particularly the Karmapa Lama. But they still respect the Dalai Lama a lot. And many mothers will ask their kids to come and touch me and get blessings from me, a very common person with no credibility under his belt. They would just ask them to touch me and respect me and get blessings because they said I was from India and India is where the Dalai Lama is living. So that's the kind of interest and that's the kind of respect I got because I was coming from India. But I must say, even the Hans, the Chinese people, they also treated me equally nicely. In places like Serta, where there is no reason for an Indian to visit, but the police, we had to register ourselves with the police. they were very happy to see a person from India, and whether it was Tibetans or Hans, everyone was falling over each other to take pictures with me. Sometimes there was confusion whether I'm from Afghanistan, whether I'm from Africa, but nonetheless, they wanted pictures with me.
Thank you, Shivaji. I see some questions and remarks from very familiar people. So let me take them in the order that they have come. One is from Lama Dobum Tulku. Lama, my deep respects to you. We have met many times before, and I hope you are well. Now, Lama Dobum remarks, this is a remark, just for a brief comment from you. I read out, sky burial, a term created by early Western writers, made up the idea of being taken the soul of the dead to the heaven. There is no such term and idea in Tibetan culture. This is what he has said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. And like I said, from my understanding of Tibetan culture, they don't have much attachment to the body once someone has already expired. But also just wanted to add that I found the Bardo, the Tibetan Bardo, which is the Book of the Dead as we know it. It's very fascinating. It makes for fascinating reading in terms of the imaginations created around this whole idea of death. So even though you may not believe in this worldview, but it makes for a lot of fascinating reading.
A question from another friend here, Ambassador Suresh Goel. How do Tibetans in Sichuan react to the suggestions of Tibetan autonomy? And do they have a notion of what autonomy means and what it would involve?
So this is a very difficult question and very difficult for people to interpret, because it's dangerous for people to explicitly take a point of view in favor of autonomy. It's dangerous for people. So for anyone to talk about this within their community or even to a stranger like myself, which in some cases can be easier actually, people would be taking great risks to share any point of view about the whole question. But here and there, we could sense the overall feeling in this context. So many, as I said, they recognize the material developments, the development in terms of healthcare and all that. But we would also hear like a lot of grudges about not being able to benefit from the local economy because the people from the Han Belt, they were the ones who were actually benefiting from all the tourism, all the developments which were taking place. There was a general feeling that the insult to the Dalai Lama, which is very rampant in Chinese media, is an insult to the entire Tibetan people, even though they were not followers of Dalai Lama. So that feeling was very much there. And once in a while, in some unguarded moments, we would hear comments like, it's just not fair. We would hear such comments. So that's the most extreme risk that people could take, I believe, when they talk about this in front of us.
So that brings me to a question by John Colkin, who says, was Buddhism freely practiced or discouraged by the Chinese? And I'd just like to add to that what you just said about different sects of Buddhism. Not everybody is a follower of Dalai Lama. There are different schools in Buddhism. So what did you find in Sichuan, not only about practice of Buddhism and the Chinese policy, but the different sects and their views?
Yes, it's been through its ups and downs. I would say at this point, it's more of an up within inverted quotes. Yeah. So there is a Buddhism which is flourishing because of Tibetans' pride in their own culture, because of slightly easier environment to practice Buddhism, and also the patronage from private practitioners, Han practitioners, who are much wealthier. And as I mentioned, from the Fujian belt, from the Canton belt, many of the rich Han Chinese, they have become huge patrons of Tibetan Buddhism, particularly in this part of the world. But there's also a government-sanctioned Buddhism, which is also flourishing. And in many places, we saw temples and monasteries being refurbished, being renovated out of both government funding as well as private Han funding. And to that extent, we also came up with curious contraptions. Like there was this machine which we found, and that machine had these mathematical things worked out. So all these mantras were turning at different angles and at different axes. So if you made one round around that machine, it was worth doing a chakra around the major mountain for almost 18 million times. So this was a big shortcut. Instead of going around 18 million times around the holy mountain, you could just turn once around this machine. And this machine was being built by the Chinese government. Yeah, so that's what is happening. There's a government-sanctioned Buddhism which is flourishing. There is a private Han sanction of Han patronage Buddhism which is flourishing, and also their own belief in their culture, which is also going. So it is not like it was maybe a few years back. And this applies to whole of China.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Certainly, at my age, I will opt for the going around the machine rather than try 18 million times to go around. But your talk on modernization of or redevelopment of these monasteries brings me a question from Vinita Ranade, another friend, who asks, has Larum changed since you visited it? I saw a National Geographic article that said that the old part of the city has been redeveloped.
So unfortunately, I haven't read that article, and I visited just 2 years back, and since then, foreigners are not allowed to go in, as far as I know at this point of time. It's a very new place. It's I don't know what you are referring to in terms of being an old city, old part of the city, because the whole Larungar was kind of built only around the 1980s in that sense. And there has been fires, there has been, earthquakes and all those things which have happened there, which means that there needs to be continuous redevelopment of that area. Having said that, some of the contacts I was in touch with, I am not able to communicate with them anymore. They have decided not to. Even before the book came out, the situation was such that they were not very keen to communicate with outsiders.
Thank you. Now, Lama Dobum Tulku has another, this time a comment and a question. He says, Shangri-La is a distorted term for Shambhala of the Kalachakra Tantra. What is the Tibetan name of this area now called Shangri-La?
Yeah. So you are very right. Shangri-La is a different name, and in fact, there are many Shangri-Las, as Mr. Ravi has mentioned. And this particular place, which is considered Shangri-La in this area that I visited, it's actually known as Riva. Yeah, the other name is Riva. That's how locals would also call it, but there is an official name which is Shangri-La, as is for the other competing places in Yunnan and Tibet and Sichuan. So that's the other official name, but locals, they call this area as Riva or Yading Valley. Those are the mountains I showed earlier. Yading is the other name for the surrounding regions in this place.
Let me ask you a question about your travels. That were you free to travel to any part of this area as you wanted? Did you have to follow a particular itinerary which you had prepared in advance? Did you, or could you just get into, a vehicle and go wherever you wanted? What was the kind of nature of your ability to go wherever you wanted?
At that point of time, yes. At that point of time, I was free to go around anywhere I wanted. And many restrictions have since come, as I mentioned. And from time to time, this has happened. Lithang, which is one of the towns we visited, and that was the place associated with both the 6th and the 7th Dalai Lama. Lithang is a very famous place in Tibetan culture. It's also the highest town, as it is known. Lithang is known as the highest town in the world at, I think, close to 4,800 meters. There have been incidents where during their annual horse festival, someone took the microphone and said something against the government. Since then, people were banned from visiting for a few years. Then it was opened again. So it has happened in ups and downs. At the time we visited, there were no such restrictions that we faced. Of course, in China, there are some other restrictions, like you can stay only in certain designated hotels which have that permit. But that is not limited to this region. It applies to whole of the other parts of mainland China as well. So we were fortunate in that sense to be able to move around without any restrictions.
Right, right. That's very useful and interesting to know. There's another question from Aruna Rodriguez. You talked about the warm welcome that both of you got everywhere. She asks, are people aware in that area of the India-China border problems? And which year was your travel? Just tell us again.
Yeah. So this travel happened around 2016, 2017. And at the time, the problems were not the same intensity as we are talking about now. And people never mentioned about this. In fact, all of my trips to China, no one has talked about the border or the historic conflicts ever. But in the news and there are also shows in Chinese media which compare the military strength of India and China and US and others, which are quite popular. And as I said, my in-laws are still based in China, and so I will be watching these shows along with them. But apart from this trip, a very interesting incident happened, not in this region, but in my other travels to China. I happened to visit Yan'an, and Yan'an is a very holy place for the Chinese communist history, because this was from where the whole Long March was associated. And Yan'an was kind of the headquarters when the Chinese Communist Party, at that time, the army was fighting the Kuomintang. And we met many people there who were actually, in a friendly way, they were pulling my leg. One guy, he was selling souvenirs, and he had a plastic gun in his hand. And he was a very elderly and very kind gentleman. And he showed me the plastic gun on my head and said that, oh, this gun was good enough for us in 1962 to beat you guys. But then he also said that I wish I had a daughter. I have only a few sons. I wish I had a daughter because he said that I wish I had a few sons because I only have daughters, because I want an Indian daughter-in-law, because we all like Indian daughters-in-laws. And so, people are friends wherever you meet each other person to person. They make fun and they are warm in most cases. But yeah, it never came in my interactions with them.
Thank you. It's good to know that our women feature so well, because you said it's a famous place. That area is famous for their beauties, and they win all manner of contests. They'll have a tough time against Indian women. That's an encouraging sign. Now, there's another question, technical question from Joya Roy. What was the mountain in your third slide?
Okay. So the third slide, I think you were talking about the Snow Mountain, and a line of Chinese tourists who were going up to the mountain. So it's a series of 3 mountains which are there in the Yabing Valley. As I mentioned, it's one of the most beautiful places I have visited in my short life so far. And these 3 mountains, Jambeang is the highest, and this mountain, I believe what you are referring to is the Mount Jambeang, which is, I believe it's the other name for Manjushri, if I'm not wrong. Manjushri, one of the bodhisattvas. So that was Mount Jambeang. I think it's about 6,700 meters high, if I'm not wrong. But there are these 3 mountains facing each other at that particular place. And that is what led to this Other Shangri-la.
Now, I'd like to ask you a question. You mentioned earlier that the monks were throwing cans and stuff around. And you also mentioned there are a lot of Chinese tourists. So, 2 questions. Were there a lot of other international tourists? And how did you find the state of the environment with these tourists? Was there despoilation? Was there problems? Or was it reasonably okay? How would you comment on these two
Yeah.
questions?
No, there were only Chinese tourists. I don't recall seeing any non-Chinese person other than me who was in this area at that point of time, and that being the peak fall season, when the colors of the trees change, is also the most popular time for people to visit. Now, having talked about Chinese tourists, most of them will go to the Yading Valley, the mountains and the rivers that I showed in my first few slides. Very few will actually go to the monasteries or the other places like Litang or Larum. I think in Larum we had at most maybe 10, 15 Han tourists who were there. Mainly they were photographers and not like casual tourists or travelers like me. They were mainly photographers because of the unique setting they were visiting that particular place. So the impact of tourism is relatively less in these places, but the Yading Valley, which is where these beautiful mountains are, there is considerable volume of tourism which happens every year, particularly this season. But as with many of the national attractions in China, as they are known as, with different star ratings, they are being managed in a proper way. The ticket prices are high, entry prices are high, which means not many people do that. But even if not many, a lot of people do that. There are staff around asking people to behave. There are bio toilets. There are dustbins and all. So we didn't find a lot of problem. But of course, around the area, there is massive infrastructure development. There is mining activities which are going on. All those do create a pressure on the regional environment as such. But for this particular attraction, it was more beneficial to maintain it in its pristine nature with access enabled rather than destroy it.
Right. I can't see any more questions. So I'm going to give you another 2 to 3 minutes, 2 minutes to say anything that you forgot to say or you want to add very quickly, and then give me a minute or two to just come to a conclusion.
Sure.
Over
So
to
I
you.
would just like to thank all of you for, first of all, to the organizers, IAC, and you, Mr. Ravi, for facilitating this, and also to all the attendees. And I enjoyed your questions and the curiosity that you displayed about people who are not your own type in that sense of the word is the whole purpose of travel writing in that sense. And I encourage that as soon as we are able to travel around. I insist and I plead with all of you to go travel to places about whom you may have biases and experience their life and their attitude towards you firsthand. So that would be my last word on today's show.
Thank you very much, Shivaji. I think I'm sure the audience will join me in saying what a great presentation this was. And I would like to thank the audience for asking such a variety and range of questions, which covered so many different areas. And you, Shivaji, for answering them very briefly, but you covered the whole ground. That's really very, very valuable. And I would like to wish you success with the sales of this book, and I look forward to more adventures from you, more visits to exotic places, more books, more talks, and including IIC. I would urge IIC authorities who are listening to keep in touch with you, and please keep in touch with me and uh, the rest of us. It's been a fascinating 1 hour, and we are almost now at the close. So I'd just like to once again thank you, thank the audience, wish everyone good health and a good journeys ahead to you, Shivaji, in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.